If you've been on the Tolkien sphere of the internet, you've undoubtedly stumbled across articles or videos titled something along the lines of Tolkien hated blank. Maybe it's Disney, maybe it's allegory, maybe it's Dune. But either way, it gives you the impression that Tolkien hated a lot of stuff. In fact, I've gotten comments asking me if Tolkien just hated everything. And while, of course, the answer to that is no, I understand why people might see this as the case. And unfortunately, we can't just blame clickbait and algorithms for this misconception. In order to explain and examine why this idea has become so prevalent and the ways that it's true and false, we're gonna have to dive deep into the history of Tolkien's scholarship, the perception of authors in the public eye through time, and a little bit about clickbait and algorithms. Let's begin this discussion in a bit of a refreshing place by talking about what Tolkien liked. And despite what the headlines might have you believe, he liked a lot of stuff. According to his letters and other sources, Tolkien actually enjoyed a wide range of Edwardian and Victorian children's literature, despite having some qualms with it. We're gonna notice a bit of a trend here, where Tolkien would profess or imply that he liked something while also leveling critique at it. That's nuance, baby. A great example of this is Lewis Carroll and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Tolkien spoke a bit about his distaste for the framing device that Carroll used, in that Alice falls into Wonderland, and it's implied to be this unreal and dreamlike place. He believed it compromised the integrity of the secondary fantastical world. And yet he also said in other places that he really enjoyed Through the Looking Glass, and he was flattered by comparisons that people made between The Hobbit and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. He more unabashedly enjoyed authors like Beatrix Potter, who was a favorite of his own children. He really was able to appreciate the way that she integrated her prose, her writing, and her art. And he thought that her stories fell just into the sweet spot of being perfectly tailored for children, whilst not speaking down to them. Tolkien rather liked The Wind in the Willows and compared himself to Mr. Toad. He said that he delighted in the works of Edith Nesbit, and he mentioned Edward Wyke Smith's The Marvelous Land of Snurgs as a particular favorite. And then, of course, there were the fairy tale works of Andrew Lang. His Red Fairy book, which contained the story of Sigurd, was a childhood favorite of Tolkien's, and it awoke in him this desire for literature about the icy north, literature that challenged his young mind. The language and stories that he found of the ancient world captured his imagination more than anything else, and it sparked in him this desire to create incredible secondary worlds. And if you share in that passion, I might recommend that you check out this video's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a world-building, writing, and game-mastering desktop software designed to support your creative endeavors, whether you are a writer, a gamer, a hobbyist, or a historian. World Anvil is perfect for creating wiki-style presentations of your world and writing, and their features include interactive maps and chronicles, which combine timelines and maps to allow you to plot events across time and space. Now, this software is fantastic for game masters and tabletop gamers of all kinds, but it's also an incredible tool for writers. World Anvil gives you all of the best tools to write, organize, and even present and publish rich settings with complex characters. Write, world build, and manage your story all on one platform. If you're looking for a solution for creating, writing, organizing, and presenting your fantasy worlds, you should give World Anvil a try. Use my code SHIRE to get yourself 51% off any yearly subscription. Thanks so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and thanks to all of you for checking out my sponsors when I have them. In his childhood and through his adulthood, Tolkien found himself enraptured by the works of English author William Morris, an early adopter of fantasy fiction. He's credited with art, poetry, and numerous translations of ancient works, such as the Aeneid, Beowulf, and Old Norse myths. Morris's original fiction is known for its anachronistic style, inventing and using words such as therewith and thereat as a way to deliberately sound more old-fashioned. There's something about Morris's work that just seemed to capture Tolkien's mind, We have records of him buying the books, lecturing on them, and, of course, taking up the mantle of translating ancient works into his own poetic style, just like William Morris. Tolkien adopted his pseudo-historical approach to writing fantasy literature, and even used some of those invented words like therewith and thereat in some of his earlier writings. As much as later on certain people would claim that Tolkien was uninfluenceable, it's clear that Tolkien had always understood his role in the grand scheme of storytelling. He wasn't creating things entirely new, but he was adopting other people's ideas and styles and concepts and casting them into his own mold of storytelling. But Tolkien wasn't just looking back into the sentimentality of children's stories or historical works. He also was a reader of contemporary fiction, including perhaps a surprising amount of science fiction. He admitted that science fiction actually plays a very similar role in storytelling to fantasy, and he really enjoyed writers like Isaac Asimov and respected writers like H.G. Wells, who he called an old forgotten master. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise to some people, especially considering the concept of Tolkien that's become popular in online discourse. There's this idea that was gathered from his writing, or from people writing about Tolkien, that he was a technophobe, that he was a complete Luddite opposed to progress, especially technological progress, of any kind. And as romantic of a notion as that is, it's just not really accurate. Tolkien reveled in new technology in his own way. He was thrilled by the ease and convenience of typewriters, he was really excited by audio recording and radio technology, and he was very quick to buy a car when they became readily available. In his official biography of Tolkien, Humphrey Carpenter writes, "There was the unforgettable occasion in 1932 when Tolkien bought his first car, a Morris Cowley that was nicknamed Joe after the first two letters of its registration. Tolkien's driving was daring rather than skillful. When accelerating headlong across a busy main road in Oxford in order to get into a side street, he would ignore all other vehicles and cry, 'Charge 'em and they scatter!' And scatter they did." Joe was later replaced by a second Morris, which did duty until the beginning of the Second World War, when petrol rationing made it impractical to keep it. By this time, Tolkien perceived the damage that the internal combustion engine and new roads were doing to the landscape, and after the war, he did not buy another car or drive again. You see, it's not that Tolkien objected outright to technological advancement or societal change. He just wanted it to be done mindfully. You can see this in The Lord of the Rings, where he doesn't rail against hobbits advancing through time and technology in their own plodding, thoughtful way. He objects to people like Saruman, who would scourge the old ways from the earth to replace them with shiny new soulless tech. It's been proposed that some of these misconceptions about Tolkien's relationship to technology may have been due to his close association with people like C.S. Lewis, who was so technophobic that he couldn't even handle the invention of a ballpoint pen, and he refused to use it throughout his entire writing career. But Tolkien himself was a very curious mind who was excited to indulge in the technology of a new era. But even the likes of C.S. Lewis couldn't deny the thrilling potential of science fiction. At one point, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis even engaged in a sort of write-off, where they tasked each other to write their own science fiction stories. Tolkien was given the assignment of writing a time travel story, which he never finished because he was a painful perfectionist sometimes. C.S. Lewis was assigned space travel as his genre, and from this he created Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength, a formidable trilogy of theologically inspired space travel science fiction. That's all to say that whatever the existing impression may be, Tolkien was actually a relatively open-minded reader and writer. When it was coming out, people even referred to The Lord of the Rings as science fiction, something that Tolkien didn't object to, despite it being pretty empirically false. And yet, I found that the overarching view of Tolkien was that he was this stodgy, eccentric Oxford professor with his nose stuffed in an ancient book, unwilling or even unable to accept new ideas, new technology, and progress. He became a caricature, and when you hear just a rough headline of Tolkien didn't like XYZ popular thing, it is really easy for that idea to fit into and enforce that caricature. He didn't like Disney, he didn't like Dune, he didn't like allegory, he didn't like democracy, he didn't like capitalism, he didn't like anything. And the hard part about this is that, well, a lot of that is true. He did admit to disliking Dune with some intensity. He professed a heartfelt loathing for Disney, but what's missing from all of those sound bites is the context. Sure, he claimed to dislike Dune, but that was in a private letter where he was specifically prompted for his opinions about Dune, and even then, he refused out of politeness to elaborate on why. In at least 2 letters, Tolkien claims his distaste for Disney, but literally a paragraph after that, he explains the much larger issue at hand. I think that this writing down, flattening, Bible in basic English attitude is responsible for the fact that so many older children and younger people have little respect and no love for words, and very limited vocabularies, and alas, little desire left, even when they had the gift which has been stultified, to refine or enlarge them. And it is possible that Tolkien had a point there, since I, as a relatively young person, have never heard the word stultified before. So yeah, he didn't like Disney, but it's not because it's just gross or whatever, it's because it was anathema to everything that he thought children's stories should be. He thought that children's media should prompt them to think deeper. It should push their boundaries. It should allow room for them to grow into being adults. And he thought that a little bit of war, blood, and death was honestly a good character building exercise. Disney, especially Disney of the mid to late 20th century, did not have that same goal, and honestly, I think you can make an argument for the way that they wrote children's literature, but that's entirely another video. But this is not context that you can glean from this simple soundbite. As long as it was possible, I should like to add, to veto anything from or influenced by the Disney studios, for all whose works I have a heartfelt loathing. The problem is that everything we know about Tolkien, or think we know about Tolkien, comes from a secondary source. Even his letters, which there are so many of, were edited by a person, by Humphrey Carpenter, who also wrote his official biography. And as valuable as these resources are, and I'm very glad we get to have them, the fact is that they're going to contain some bias. They were put through the filter of another person, no matter how good their intentions were. I think one of the best examples of how this filtering can cause wires to get crossed is in the case of Narnia. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first of the Chronicles of Narnia, was written by C.S. Lewis, who, as you might have gathered, was a close personal friend of Tolkien's. They were in a casual writers' club called the Inklings, which would gather together every week to share progress and critique their writing. Now, Tolkien was, somewhat famously, not a fan of Narnia. In a biography on C.S. Lewis, Roger Green reports that C.S. Lewis once claimed that upon hearing the first couple chapters of the first draft of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Tolkien disliked it intensely. Now, okay, I'm not saying that C.S. Lewis is spreading false information, but this alleged conversation happened in the 40s. This biography came out in the 70s. So we're looking at roughly 30-year, 25-year time gap here. And, well, memory is a monster. This is a writer claiming something that C.S. Lewis claims Tolkien said 30 years ago on a Thursday night. Then again, this claim is bolstered by the fact that Roger Green had a conversation after having this conversation with C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien said, "I hear you've been reading Jack's children's story. It really won't do, you know? I mean to say, nymphs and their ways, the love life of a faun. Doesn't he know what he's talking about?" So that is a little bit more damning, but I think it should be noted that Tolkien isn't just saying, "Oh yeah, Narnia, I think that's garbage." he is specifically harping on one detail from The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, which Tolkien had as a particular pet peeve, which was C.S. Lewis's slapdash use of mythological characters. Fauns, like Mr. Tumnus in Narnia, are based off of Greek satyrs, and satyrs and nymphs, which are mentioned in Mr. Tumnus's bookshelf, are traditionally just these complete debaucherous, overtly sexual creatures. Just take a look at this copiously blurred out art. Tolkien thought it was weird that a satyr was inviting a child into his home. He thought it was strange that Mr. Tumnus was meant to be a good and admirable character, instead of being overtly freaky. But this really just comes down to matters of differing taste. C.S. Lewis appreciated history, and so he wanted to include certain nods to mythology in his works. The historical precedents didn't really matter. He didn't have the belief that Tolkien did, that these creatures were marked with certain indelible traits. It's just not that deep. But for Tolkien, it is always that deep. Now, that's not the only reason that Tolkien disliked Narnia, and someday I'll do a full video on that, but it's these, little gripes and little pet peeves that caused him to make statements like, "I hear you've been reading Jack's story, it simply won't do," and those kinds of claims go viral. But the reality of the situation is so much more complicated and so much more interesting. In 1971, Tolkien wrote to someone, "I am glad that you have discovered Narnia. These stories are deservedly very popular. But since you ask if I like them, I am afraid the answer is no. I do not like allegory, and least of all religious allegory of this kind, but that is a difference of taste which we both recognized and did not interfere with our friendship." Now, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but he does acknowledge that the popularity of Narnia is deserved, and he also gave his granddaughter copies of Narnia to read before he gave her copies of his own books. You see, it's never quite as simple as Tolkien disliked this thing. Tolkien disliked a lot of things, but that didn't mean that he couldn't accept their merit and their value. He also acknowledged on multiple occasions that his opinions were not always correct, and that he should not be an arbiter of taste. He wrote to Lewis, "I have something that I deeply desire to make, and which it is the largely frustrated bent of my nature to make. I think this prevents me from being a critic worth considering as a rule, and it probably makes me at my worst when other writers' lines come too near, as yours do at times. There is liable to be a short circuit, a flash, an explosion, and even a bad smell, one ingredient of which may be mere jealousy." When it comes to something like Narnia, it was really a perfect storm for Tolkien to take issue with it. He was very picky about allegories, especially religious ones, and he admittedly had problems when he felt like other people were trying to steal his thunder. And while Narnia certainly is not a Lord of the Rings copy, it must be said that after sitting in a room with someone every Thursday night for years, reading out chapters of your long-belabored medieval fantasy project, it might not feel great when someone comes in 7 years, rattles off 7 books of an entire medieval fantasy series. And none of this is helped by the fact that Tolkien, again, quite admittedly and openly, sometimes had problems with overstating. Call it the occasional overreaction. He would very often say something that was really bold, really inflammatory, and perhaps too aggressive, and later on, after he had cooled off, he would walk it back. He would, nuance it a bit. In one of his letters, Tolkien has just received a transcript of an interview that he did. They want to get his approval on it before they publish it. And Tolkien has to reply with a long letter of corrections and adjustments because, in his opinion, the interview went a bit off the rails. He explains that he's sorry that he mumbled so much, to the point where they couldn't understand him for a lot of it. He apologizes for his frantic and constant pacing through the entire interview, and he says that he doesn't usually smoke that much, but that he was really nervous, and the smoking helped him calm down a bit. And on top of that, he then amends a lot of what he said. He walks back his rather forward critique of Dante. He apologizes for coming across as vain when he meant to sound self-deprecating, and he explains that his struggle with reading modern literature doesn't come from a place of feeling better than it, but it's just because of the incredibly high standards and preferences that he set for his own work. He admits that his taste is not normal and says that he is a man of limited sympathies, but well aware of it. Tolkien was not the kind of man who could just turn his brain off. He consumed media with the same exacting, perfectionistic standards with which he wrote his own works. Tolkien's Modern Reading, which is a great resource if you want to look more into this stuff, explains, "This was not just holiday reading, undertaken to fill up tedious train journeys or as a distraction while recovering from illness. No, he read thoughtfully, discerningly, and receptively." Tolkien's comment reveals he had read extensively in modern fiction, but had such exactingly high standards and peculiar preferences that relatively few books suited his taste. This is the mark of a man who is interested in and engaged with modern fiction, not one who finds it irrelevant or insignificant. Tolkien was critical of the literature he read because he loved literature. He didn't like Dune because it didn't fit his very specific taste, and he didn't like Disney because he thought that we could do better. Tolkien disliked things so strongly because he loved them so strongly. He was an intensely passionate man who, better yet, understood how sometimes that passion could get him carried away, and he was careful to amend his more inflammatory statements when necessary. We are trying to peer back through time at this immensely complicated, multifaceted, firecracker of an intellectual through a game of telephone, basically. A set of blurry telescope lenses, a collection of heavily edited letters and essays and recollections. We don't know J.R.R. Tolkien personally, and we never will. And on top of that, he never wanted us to know him like that. Tolkien didn't like to share a lot of what he read and enjoyed because he feared that it would lead to people source hunting, trying to dig up the roots of Middle-earth just to see where it came from. I fear you might be right that the search for the sources of The Lord of the Rings is going to occupy academics for a generation or two. I wish this need not be so. To my mind, it is the particular use in a particular situation of any motive, whether invented, deliberately borrowed, or unconsciously remembered, that is the most interesting thing to consider. When, later on in his career, Tolkien became the center of a cult fan base, he detested it. It's not like every single one of his posthumously published letters was a tweet. It's not like it was something that he was aware in some corner of his mind was being blasted out to the cell phones of every literate person with internet in the world. Most of his letters, including the ones where he claims to dislike or despise popular media, were written in private to one single person in confidence. Tolkien was not like the modern author, media trained and ready to put out hot takes at just the right time to boost the algorithm to get XYZ thing in the media. He was just a writer, someone who liked to read and to write, who had no idea that he was going to become a myth or a tastemaker for generations to come. Now that is all to say that I thank God every day that Tolkien didn't have a Twitter account. But this whole problem is, unfortunately, much larger than just Tolkien. On the internet, we are subject to an incredibly intense negativity bias. As people, as Homo sapiens, which at least I am, we are, from the day we are born, drawn to negativity. We see it more readily, we remember it more easily, and we click on it. Now, this isn't necessarily a defect. It paid for our ancestors to know and remember more specifically what hurt them, what poisoned them, who hurt them, and what sort of things they should avoid. But modern technology has enabled this negativity bias to an unhealthy degree. Algorithms prioritize rage bait or hate posts or call-out posts because we have the biological imperative to click on those and stay on those. And as creators, we are constantly pushed to feed into this. If you take a look at the top 4 performing videos on my channel here, 3 of those contain some form of negativity in either the title or the thumbnail. It is just how you get people to click these days. So not only was Tolkien a very selective reader and consumer of media, prone to occasional overstatements and overreactions, caricaturized by those studying him even during his lifetime, the negativity bias online would also rather promote what Tolkien hated rather than what he enjoyed. Now, the bad news here is that none of this is going to stop anytime soon. In my opinion, it's not really reasonable to tell creators and educators to stop doing this, to stop playing up Tolkien's more negative opinions, because the reality is it's just never going to happen. And if creators don't clickbait a bit, if they don't play into the algorithm to get their video put in front of people, guess what? Creators who aren't as educated, who don't want to present a nuanced approach, who don't care about the integrity of the content that they make, are going to make those videos anyway and continue pushing the concept that Tolkien was just some kind of a misanthropic hater guy. Sometimes, and this is one of the things that I struggle with the most, as a creator, you do have to sacrifice a little bit of your academic integrity just to get people to the door. And from there, hopefully you can blast them with as much nuance and academic honesty as possible, but you still have to get people to the door. And let me be honest here, this is far from a new problem. From the moment that people started caring about Tolkien, people have been pushing his more negative and inflammatory takes. People described Tolkien's reaction to Narnia as apoplectic, which Merriam-Webster describes as having a stroke, all over like 3 notes in 3 letters and private conversations where Tolkien basically said, "Narnia isn't really my thing." This has been and likely always will be a thing for Tolkien and every other person in the world. And while, of course, we should do what we can to call out creators who are doing more egregious harm with what they're saying, part of the responsibility does fall onto you, the consumer of this media. Anytime you find yourself falling down a new rabbit hole, a new show, a new writer, a new theme in history, a new educator, it is very worthwhile to click out of the app which you have fallen down the rabbit hole of and do some of your own research. Check the sources of the people that are educating you. Read an article from a different author. Check out a book on the subject. Do your own research in your own time. Don't assume that just because it's in a Reddit post or a headline, it's true. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but sometimes people on the internet lie. As consumers of media, we need to be aware of the fact that our attention is money, and people will do anything to get that attention, even if it means spreading dishonesty, fear, and hatred. And when it comes to looking at people, to learning about people from the present or the past, it is so important to remember that as much as it is fun to have our little characters, to imagine what they were like, these are real people. And as tricky as it can sometimes be to unravel the layers of that character, to find the root of the real person underneath, it is always worthwhile. Online Tolkien scholarship is a really interesting place because I feel like people are so hyper aware of the impact that he has had on fantasy and the things that he has created, but we are still very, very slowly getting to know who he was as a real person. And if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into this, I do recommend checking out the Humphrey Carpenter Tolkien biography, whilst keeping in mind that Humphrey Carpenter had his own biases, so don't take any of it at face value. I also highly recommend checking out these books, which are just two examples of a lot of the modern Tolkien scholarship going on. These are two very different Tolkien scholars with very different points of view, which means that it's so fun to compare and contrast what they have written. There is also a revised and expanded version of Tolkien's letters that just came out, I think, this year, and I highly recommend checking that out if you want a bit more of a nuanced approach to Tolkien's letters. I feel like I've said the word nuanced like 30 times in this video. But as always, your best bet for getting to know Tolkien is probably just diving a little bit deeper into what he wrote and what he put out there. I promise there is an absolutely fascinating man buried in there. So happy reading, ye Tolkien scholars, young and old. Just please remember that everybody in history, in biographies, and on the internet is a real person, and they deserve the understanding and respect that you would give to anyone else. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something, consider giving it a like, because that really helps me out with the algorithmic gods. And do consider subscribing if you want to come back here every week to hear me talk about Tolkien and other stuff also. I have been working on our Halloween special video this year since like June, so please stay tuned for that one because I am very excited. My Patreon is linked down there if you want to check it out, but either way, it has been so wonderful having you here this week, and I hope that you have a very happy, hobbity day.